Hello everyone, my name is Akal and I am a somatic therapist. If you would like to find out a little bit more about what it is that I do, you can check out the link down below this video. What I want to talk about today is this is the second video in my series of videos on unpacking the penis. Today specifically is about the shaming of the male mojo. And by mojo, I mean a man's sexual prowess. What's going on culturally speaking right now is that media, social media, et cetera, pretty much every time anything, any man, let's say a political, a politician or, some sort of Hollywood elite type or whatever it is, does something naughty, it gets spread all through the media. And this kind of chain reaction of things that occurs, it ends up basically resulting in that throughout the course of the year, we all look at collectively, let's say on average, hypothetically, anyone who's particularly diligent about keeping up with the news is looking at probably, let's say, 1,000 stories a year. Now, out of those 1,000 stories, if you're seeing 400 or 500 times, men are bad, men are bad, men are bad, even specific men are bad. And actually a lot of the stuff that I've been seeing really goes into cutting down men in terms of like patriarchal culture and how we're responsible for the condition of the world today. I'm not going to argue one way or another about this. And I'm also going to say that I think a lot of the shaming that's currently going on is somewhat well-deserved. However, it's also creating kind of, at least across all men, we're collectively carrying a burden now. And that burden is of shame and guilt. I personally feel it. It's minuscule because, I'm a big fuck you person. So when somebody tries to shame me, I just kind of push it back in their face. But nonetheless, every man is collectively carrying this shame on some level. And I don't think it's particularly healthy. So I want to kind of go over a little bit about, why is shaming so effective? Shaming is a way of controlling people. It's kind of a social tool in some ways. So if you want to get a whole group of people in line, in terms of like, let's get everyone on the same page here, you shame them. You think about environmental stuff. Again, I'm not going to go into, climate change and things like that. But if you want to get people on board with the particular mainstream climate change narrative, then you shame those who are in opposition. And it works really well. And so this is happening to men. Men are being shamed a big time. And what's going to happen, though, is men are going to push back at some point, and I guarantee it. And that pushback is going to be men embracing more masculinity. And hopefully we do it with more awareness this time around. So, and I'll get into that a little bit later in the video. So, one of the things about shaming that makes it so incredibly powerful and so effective is because we're all kind of conditioned to respond to it on some level, because we all want to fit in. We all want to be part of our culture on some level. Even those of us like myself who tend to rebel all the time, I still want to fit in on some level. I mean, my purpose in life is very social. So because I have a social purpose, being left out of that purpose, it would depress the hell out of me. And particularly if I felt some sort of shame or guilt around that. There was a book that was written in the late 90s, and it's called Power versus Force. And it was written by Dr. David Hawkins. Now, Power versus Force was a wonderful book for me because it illustrated something in kind of a chart-like way or a numeric kind of way, a way which I could quantify emotion. So, and I won't go into details what Dr. Hawkins' techniques were, but he largely used muscle testing. And what he did is he measured a full range of emotions, of human emotion, from, dead, in which you've got no emotion. And in this case, I'm looking at emotion from the perspective of energy in motion. So dead is 0 on his scale. The top of the scale he called 1,000. So 1,000 on the scale was total enlightenment. You've achieved the Tibetan rainbow body, you've turned to ash, and you've dissolved back into all creation. So on this particular scale, as he's measuring emotions, the lowest energy emotion is that of shame, and that was at 20. So it's only 20 points higher than 0 or dead. Guilt was number 2 at 30. So, if you're in guilt or shame, you're pretty close to dead. And most of us who've been carrying around shame or guilt, we know that there's kind of like a depressing effect of that energy. And again, most of us don't consider that significant, but it's highly significant. It's incredibly important that we take all these emotional states in for being significant and meaningful, because they are. The moment you accept something as significant and meaningful, it gives you an opportunity to perceive it more clearly. And I'll get into that a little bit when I go into awareness. So Dr. Hawkins, when he was measuring these emotions, here's something else that's really interesting about his book, is that he measured anger, for instance. Like anger was, if I'm remembering correctly, it was like 158 to 160. So something else that measured around then was politics. Politics, I believe, was 162. So if you can take that into account, that makes a lot of sense, right? Can anyone actually have a discussion about politics without perking up a little bit with anger? But basically what the statement here is that anger actually has a great deal of energy for movement, for getting shit done. However, shame does not. It represses your energy in a nasty way. So what I'm going to suggest here is that a lot of the ancient religions, the old-time religions, which are current religions as well, a lot of these religions, they used shame as a tool for control. And I also, one of the things is that, government entities do this as well when they attempt to legislate what goes on in our bedrooms. One of the things that goes on here is that when a religion wants people to obey their particular doctrine, they say, something like, pleasure is bad, like sex is bad, which, basically says your capacity, your ability to be creative in life is bad. It's negative. Your ability to experience pleasure and to be in your body is bad. It's negative. And again, this depresses human life force. And if you're depressing the human life force, what you're doing is you're also depressing the individual's cognitive abilities, you're depressing their immune system, you're depressing all functions of what it is for that individual to be a human being. That's significant. So now how is all this dangerous, at least in particularly now in contemporary times? What's going on now in contemporary times is we don't necessarily have a very strong religious institution that's exercising control over the masses. We get a little bit of that with the government, not a whole lot. But again, with the media and the social media, shaming men, what's happening is that our innate, how do I say this? Our sexual energy, which is innate in us, is being depressed. And it's being distorted. How this translates out into life means that a lot of men don't have as much confidence. Again, their sexual prowess, their mojo, they don't have as much confidence. I get a lot of men who come to me now and they're way too young to be having a lot of the symptoms they're having in terms of erectile dysfunction and premature ejaculation. And yes, a lot of it has to do with their practices in life in terms of, too frequently, ejaculating too frequently and things like that. But I also do believe that a lot of it is, it's kind of the distortion that men are carrying around. Their sexual energy has been distorted by this shame. So this again is really, really important to understand. So when we're born in this life, we're given certain tools to utilize. And sexual energy for a man is incredibly important, and it's what sets us apart from women ultimately. When you shame a man's sexual energy, you're shaming his creative capacity in life, his ability to do things, his ability to get shit done, his ability to feel purpose. The suicide rate among men who've got no purpose, who are unemployed, is incredibly high. And again, this is all very significant. The Other thing that ends up happening with men who have been shamed a great deal, it has to do with social isolation. And again, I mentioned this before, it's very important for men to, well, and for human beings in general, to feel social and to be connected to other people. So when you shame somebody, when they're harboring a great deal of shame about whatever it is they're feeling shame about, you end up basically creating an individual who's more likely to isolate themselves. And that isolation, anyway, it's a nasty domino effect. Eventually they just don't want to engage in life so much, and they take on a lot of negative characteristics. And anyway, it can lead into more harmful acts to themselves or to others. So what I suggest is a lot of the shaming that's actually going on, actually it will end up creating more crime, more issues. So the one thing to keep in mind here also is that there's kind of a new type of victim being created. There's men now collectively are kind of a victim. And what I suggest every man recognize here is that you are truly not a victim. And the reason you're not a victim has nothing to do with whether something good in this case, whether something bad has happened to you, whether you've been assaulted or whether you feel assaulted, or whether you feel, like I do, kind of attacked, by the media, even though they're not attacking me specifically. But it becomes really important for me to recognize that pattern in my own being. And it's through meditation that I have this opportunity to witness, again, my agitation, my feeling of victimhood, because, all men are now like evil, we're all like sexual predators and et cetera, et cetera. So one of the things that becomes really important is that a man has to recognize there's two words that every man needs to recognize. Anytime you feel like a victim or you feel shame or guilt about something, keep in mind that in order to liberate that life force which has been depressed when you're in those emotional states, there's a number of things you can do, but the two words again that are most important are acceptance, one. And why acceptance? Acceptance because in meditation and in life in general, you cannot control everything. There's positive, there's negative, there's all sorts of impressions. Shit happens in life. So you really simply have to accept. In particular, in meditation, you have to accept all that rises. If you have a preference, what you end up doing is I prefer to look at this as opposed to that. And what ends up happening is the act of repressing that, when you're in meditation, ends up pushing it back down, and you feed it back into the cycle or to the loop, and then it will once again rise to the surface at some point. Now, once you've gotten to the place where you can attain some sort of centered self or like a neutral state, you can see these things clearly. You can see the positive and the negative, and you can make a choice. And making the choice is the key. A choice to express or to not express. Let's say a sexual fantasy rises in your mind. This sexual fantasy, I won't tell you what it is. It's in my mind. So let's say the sexual fantasy, this whatever it is that rises up, and you're like, oh, I really want to do that. But let's say you have past experience with this particular sexual fantasy, and in the past it wasn't particularly gratifying. Or let's say this fantasy is also depends on another person or people participating, and you're not really sure that they're going to be on board with that. In all likelihood, it's going to create a situation, because there is internal conflict about it, it's going to create a situation which might lead to a harmful act. So again, fantasy rises. If you have presence, if you're neutral, if you're aware, and if you're witnessing, you can say, I'll pass. And the other thing is, now let's say you do act out, you create a mess, and now you're harboring guilt or shame. Now what you need to do is you need to access forgiveness. If you can access forgiveness, you can once again liberate that life force which is being bound up. So forgiveness of yourself, and let's say there was another person involved and you feel like a victim on some level, you have to forgive the other person. Victimhood is very much like shame or guilt in that it destroys life force. It restricts life force. And I know in our culture right now there's a lot of you can kind of get put on pedestal if you have certain victimhood patterns in our culture currently, and that's weird to me. But all that being said, I appreciate you guys listening to this video, and I thank you much.